Hi class, welcome to Research Methods as we get started with our Chapter 5 on experimental research. So for this video, we are going to be looking at what is experimental research, kind of going over the conditions of what defines experimental research, going into the types and challenges associated with experimental designs. And I have a little what if example to kind of add context to what we're looking at when we're talking about experimental research. And then going into a couple of the frequently asked questions that students in prior classes have brought up regarding this chapter. So we'll get started. So, what is experimental research itself? Well, this is the class or category of research that is necessary for looking at a causal relationship. So, what do I mean by that? When a researcher conducts a study, they're looking for typically what treatment creates an outcome. So, that's your independent variable, like the treatment. If you were seeing a treatment for depression, does this treatment result in the outcome of less depression? And that's the trick of it, that experimental research is focused on causal relationships. This situation causes this outcome. So that's not the same as when researchers talk about correlational research. And correlation is just two things happen to happen at the same time. Like, as the temperature rises outside, we have more ice cream sales. It doesn't mean that the temperature causes the ice cream sales. It just means that they happen to move at the same time, at the same instances. So experimental research knocks it up a notch and says this causes that. So it has some strict conditions on it to be able to make that level of a claim. It has very strict rules to fit into this category of being experimental research. So the two main rules are that the researcher has to manipulate the IV. They have to manipulate the independent variable and create or proactively indicate participants being in one condition or another. So back to that ice cream and temperature. The researcher cannot designate what temperature the day is going to be. So that could not be experimental research. You see what I mean? Whereas there are conditions and independent variables that the researcher can indicate what condition the participant is going to experience in that independent variable. That's what we mean by manipulating the IV. Controlling for extraneous influences, extraneous variables. What is an extraneous variable? Pretty much anything that's not the IV or DV. Anything that's not the independent variable or dependent variable is going to be an extraneous variable. And sometimes they're no big deal. Sometimes they're not impacting us being able to look at the relationship between the IV and the DV. But sometimes they do impact it. And when they do, when that extraneous variable impacts, that's either related to the conditions of the independent variable, or it's somehow related to the outcome and we're not accounting for it, now it's a confounding variable. So it's like a supercharged extraneous variable or a problematic extraneous variable. That would be a confounding variable. And that's why experimental research is typically conducted in a lab where you can control the experience. You can control the situation. You can make sure that the participants are getting the same treatment except for the independent variable. And that's very controlled situation. So The three things you want to remember about experimental research. The researcher has to manipulate the IV. They have to control for extraneous variables. And this is the only type of research design that can truly make a causal relationship claim. So keep those in mind. So we're going to look at some of the basic types of experimental designs. They fall mainly into two groups, between subjects design and a within subjects design. So here's a basic graphic I have for you. In this one, between subjects design, the participants are put into either the treatment group or the control group. So no matter how many groups, it's not that there's two, it just means that the participants only see one condition. Like we have the treatment condition, the control condition, and any participant in that study only goes to one or the other. If there were like 4 conditions, then the participant would only see condition 1 or 2 or 3 or 4. So it's independent. Each condition is independent of others, right? And this is the type of study that compares a treatment group to a control group between subjects. It's also called independent groups design, so you might see it called that way. And then the within subjects design or within subjects experiment, the participants see every condition. So if there's well, first we're going to get a baseline and find out what a participant's, say, depression level is. And then we're going to do one type of treatment and see what the depression level is there. And then you could have more than one condition again, more than 2. It can keep going, but the trick of the within subjects design is that the participant sees every condition until they end the study, okay? And then this mixed design is just showing that you could have both at the same time. It is rather complicated, but it would compare both a set of participants who go through all of the conditions and a set of participants that go through the conditions but in a control group. So that gets a little more complicated there. They don't really talk about that one in your chapter, not in chapter 5, but it is something they get into in further chapters. Distinguishing between the different types of experimental designs may look easy, but it can be tricky. One reason is because sometimes there's using different names. Like I said, between subjects experiments are sometimes called independent groups designs, and also the within subjects is sometimes called repeated measures. So you might see those terms as well. So let's put a scenario to this, just a little what if, to add some context to what we're talking about with experimental research. Let's say a teaching or learning area researcher proposes that a hybrid delivery of a course causes better learning outcomes for students compared to other delivery methods. So let's say they're looking at different ways of administering a course. A hybrid where, like, let's say during a week, one class is online and the second class of the week is in person. So some kind of hybrid delivery method compared to being fully online or being fully face-to-face. So just looking at that, what would be the dependent variable? And again, the dependent variable is what we're measuring at the end. What are they looking to find a change in? And what they're looking to find a change in here is the learning outcomes. So that's what this researcher is looking for. Are there differences in these learning outcomes based on the independent variable? And what is the independent variable? It's the delivery method. And that's a tricky part. It's easy to get a little confused with what is the independent variable here, because I could say, well, there's three. There's the hybrid delivery, the fully online, and the face-to-face. But that's not that's an easy mistake to make. There's actually only one independent variable here, the delivery method, and it's got three levels or three conditions. It's got the hybrid condition, the fully online condition, and the face-to-face condition. So that's one you got to watch out for. So if we take this scenario, let's look at those two basic designs that we just introduced. First, the between subjects experiments. And again, that between subjects compares between these different conditions of the IV. Again, there's only one IV there, one independent variable of delivery method, and it's got three levels: the hybrid delivery method, the fully online delivery method, and the face-to-face delivery method. And notice I called these control 1 and control 2. The control can be like no treatment at all, but it can be the treatment that usually is given, similar to the drug kind of experiment, where usually the treatment for depression might be a certain type of psychotherapy, but they want to see if a new type of therapy makes a difference, right? So they're not going to not give therapy at all to someone, because that would just be unethical. But they will have them do what the normal therapy is, and then try this new type of therapy as the treatment group. So sometimes a control group is not nothing. It's just what has been typically provided. So in our scenario here, what has been typically provided is either fully online courses or face-to-face courses. And the one that's being compared, the one that's the treatment, is this hybrid delivery method. So again, in between subjects, so independent groups, participants are placed into one of these conditions. They don't see all of them. They only see one. And then the DV, or the dependent variable, we said it was learning outcomes. And back in our chapter 4, when we were talking about how our psychological measurements determined, we had to operationalize. How are we going to measure this? How are we going to measure learning outcomes? Well, one way to measure it is by looking at a student's GPA. So are there differences in GPA at graduation between these three groups? If there are significant differences and the hybrid group is significantly higher than the other two, then that would support the hypothesis that the hybrid delivery method was a better treatment, a better delivery method, and caused better outcomes. Okay, so that's between subjects, just with a scenario to kind of pull it in there. But what we want to look at in any causal relationship, any experimental design, is what alternative explanations might be going on here. And that's that piece about controlling for extraneous variables. What could be impacting someone's GPA at graduation other than just what delivery method they were in the course, right? Are there differences between these groups that are not really due to the course itself? It's due to something else. That would be an extraneous variable. And if that difference between those groups is impacting GPA, it then becomes a confounding variable. So the researcher has to think through what could be causing differences in these three groups. One difference that could happen is that students who sign up for the hybrid course or sign up for the fully online course, like that if students choose which course they're going to, they might have chosen the one that they like best. Well, then their learning outcome is not based on the delivery, it's based on the student's preferences. And that's not what the experiment was testing, like how much you like different delivery methods is causing differences in learning outcomes, right? How does a researcher deal with these challenges of between subjects designs? That there could be systematic differences between the groups that are not related to delivery method, right, to the ID. And the way they work with that is random assignment. You have this group of students who are going to take that class, let's say Intro to Psychology, just to give us a class to work with. And you could just take the whole group of students that have to go take Intro to Psych, and you take 1/3 of them and tell them you're taking the hybrid course. You take another third of them and say you're taking the fully online course. And the last third of them and go, you're taking the face-to-face course. And just randomly taking all those students and putting them to one of those three conditions. That would be random assignment. And the trick of random assignment is that any single participant has the same chances of getting into whichever of those conditions. It'd be like flipping a coin or taking a random number generator and saying, oh, you're in group 3, and oh, you're in group 1 for each participant. And there's different ways to accomplish a random assignment that they go over in your chapter. But I also put in Canvas a little video link that's like a 5-minute video about how random assignment works. There's another issue that can come up in between subjects design, and that's if the groups are being treated differently. For example, if you had different teachers for each of those Intro to Psych courses, right? A different teacher for the hybrid course compared to a teacher for the online course and the face-to-face course, they might teach differently, right? You've had instructors that teach differently. If that's the case, then that might change the learning outcomes. That would be a confounding variable because it has an impact on being able to draw causal conclusions there. And the way the researcher would deal with something like this is a standardization of the procedures. That maybe you have the same instructor teaching all three of those conditions. The same instructor doing the hybrid course, teaching the online course and the face-to-face course, so that there aren't really differences in style per se. Could work, right? You could say, yeah, I have the same professor or the same instructor for each of those conditions, but they're actually really good as an online professor and they really suck as a face-to-face professor. So then, again, it could be a confounding variable based on the competence of using that delivery method, right? So there's a lot of things that go into controlling those potential alternative explanations. And that's part of experimental design. You want to think about what other issues might be a problem for this design. Anything that could possibly explain a difference in the learning outcome for those three groups is a potential confounding variable that has to be controlled. Okay. Let's look at within subjects experiments. Again, this one is different. It's where the participant sees all of the conditions. Now, why would we do that, right? Well, remember in the between subjects design, we want the participants to be somewhat similar in each group. We don't want all of the participants who just like hybrid in the hybrid group. We want everyone spread out because we want those individual differences to be similar in each of those independent groups. When you have a within subjects design, you don't have to worry about that because the same participants are in each condition. So whatever differences they had, they're going to still be the same differences in each condition that they're going into. So the same participants in the hybrid group are exactly the same as the ones in the fully online group and the ones in the face-to-face group because they all see each condition. So it helps with that. But it does bring out other issues. And when we talk about controlling for carryover effects, what we're talking about here is that the participants need to have different orders. Like in this first one, participants go to the hybrid and then the fully online and the face-to-face. Well, if it's the same course, then maybe they already had the information that they needed in the first run, the first part of the course, right? And then when they went into fully online, they already had like a primer and now they perform better. And then when they go to face-to-face, they perform even better. So maybe what's going on here in being the GPA increasing or the performance increasing is that they are just understanding the material better. So that practice effect, that's what's going on, not really the delivery method itself. So you would have to put the treatment at different locations in the order. And this is trying to account for order effects and the knowledge you're gaining in the first segment impacting the second segment or the third segment. Another order effect that we talk about in the chapter is fatigue. It may be that performance goes down because the participants are just so tired of this by now, right? After they've done the first set and then go to the second, and it's like, my gosh, please, I'm done. So fatigue effects can play into this one. And that might be an alternative explanation for someone's learning outcomes at the end, right? So there's different issues that we need to work with when you're setting up a within subjects experiment where the participants see each condition, even with putting hybrid at 3 different locations, in the first, in the second, and the third. There's other issues going on here. Like notice that fully online comes before face-to-face. So in this series, fully online is before face-to-face, here it's before face-to-face, and here it's before face-to-face. So this isn't a complete counterbalance. This is just one that put hybrid, the treatment group, in each location. But it really didn't mix up the whole thing. So that could be another alternative explanation that could be messing with the system here. Okay, our challenge is having enough participants, recruitment for an adequate sample size, and then order effects due to fatigue, practice, and carryover. We have to do a counterbalancing, and that's how the researcher would try to address the order effects, potential extraneous variable there. So the fully counterbalance. This is easy when you only have 2 groups, when you only have 2 conditions of the independent variable. So if you have just a treatment and a control, or a treatment A, treatment B, it's pretty easy to flip those around and you've counterbalanced the whole thing. It's a little more difficult as you have more independent variable conditions. Like ours has 3, our little what if has 3 conditions. So to be able to get that many sequences, it's basically taking a factorial. And that just means you take how many conditions you have and then you multiply it down. So 3 conditions would be 3 times 2 times 1. That's 6 groups, because 3 times 2 is 6, and that times 1 is still 6. So when I have 3 conditions, I would need 6 sequences, 6 groups, to be able to do the whole thing. And again, if we need at least 30 participants per group, that's a lot of people, right? That's a lot of subjects. Now, what if we had 4? What if we had 4 conditions? So that's 4 times 3 times 2 times 1. Let's work on it. That would be 24. 24 sequences would be needed to fully counterbalance a experimental design that is within subject's experiment. So the participants see all of the conditions. And then again, you would need the head count. You would need sample size for each one of those groups going through the sequence. So sometimes within groups, it gets a little more difficult to run. Right? Okay. So those are the 2 basic ways of running an experimental research, the between subject experiment and the within subjects experiment. But like going back to our little what if, could it really be conducted as a true experiment? Going back to, I think it was in chapter 2 where we talk about what makes a viable experiment. Is it possible? Is it feasible? Is it ethical to manipulate the IV? Well, not really. Now, for example, maybe it's possible to take, for a university, to say, take all the students who are going to be taking general psychology and saying, okay, this is the course you're taking. Don't know if it would be ethical, because students choose a course based on what is best for them. Like maybe they're working and they need to take an online course. Well, random assignment is a random assignment. You don't get to select it, because then it would no longer be experimental design. It would be different. So can you really manipulate which course, like by random assignment, which course each student is going to take, the hybrid, the fully online, or the face-to-face? Probably not. Probably not ethical, probably not feasible for a researcher or an institution to do that. So that controlling for extraneous variables becomes really difficult with this what if. You can't really random assign conditions. And if you were trying to set it up as a within subjects experiment, would you really have students taking a course in hybrid and then taking the same course online and then taking the same course in face-to-face mode? Not likely. Would you have them take one course with each third of the course being a different delivery method? It starts becoming less feasible, right? A little more complicated than just saying, hey, we'll do it this way. So it's cool to play with ideas and say, hey, what could I do if we completely forget about being feasible or ethical? Sure, there's different things we can say. Theoretically, this is how this would be set up as an experimental. But actually running a true experiment is much more complicated once you figure out, is it feasible? Is it ethical? A couple questions that tend to come from this chapter, from prior runs of the class, have been, what are noisy data and how do researchers deal with biases? So what are noisy data? Well, noisy just means variation, There's variability going on in the data. Everyone's not going to score exactly the same, which is not always a bad thing. You want to see variation. But variation that's not due to the independent variable, like 2 being in one of those delivery methods, one of those conditions of the independent variable, is an extraneous variable. And if it's systematically different across those different conditions, then it becomes a confounding variable that could be a problem. It makes it more difficult to determine if the variation is due to the conditions or due to this extra variable that's adding into the system. So I'm going to move over to JASP, which is a program we're going to be working with more often going into module 2 and 3 here, and open up a data file I call noisy data 5. So what I have here is JASP, and you might not have gone through the intro data work video yet and done a little orientation to JASP. No worries, I'm just moving around in it and you can see what I'm doing. In our what if scenario for chapter 5, we talked about what if the researcher wanted to look at differences in a learning outcomes dependent variable based on which group, the hybrid, the face-to-face, or the fully online delivery method. So the one independent variable with 3 conditions. And to do that, I have some data just to play with, noisy data 5. And this is an example of what do we mean by noisy data? Well, when I open up the data set itself, it's got the groups, which group the students were in, the hybrid, face-to-face, or fully online, and what their GPA was. And then to run it, I go to descriptives, and I'm just looking at what is the average GPA. Average GPA across all the groups is 2.6. But then if I say, okay, what is the average for each group? Now what I have is a table that shows that the face-to-face group had an average of 2.9, the hybrid group had an average GPA of 2.6, and the online group had an average of 2.3. And then the last thing I'm going to do here is I'm going down into plots and getting a visual. Whoa. I'm asking for a box plot, and it creates it over here in my results panel. There we go. So here's the average of the face-to-face group, that dark line in the middle, the average of the hybrid group, and the average of the online group. But what you want to look at here is this spread. Notice how the face-to-face group is kind of just a chunk box, and the online group is just a chunk box, but the hybrid group has this really wide distribution of values here compared to the others. And this suggests that there's something going on. There's something else that should be accounted for. That's a potential extraneous variable, a potential confounding variable if it's impacting the GPA. So that's what we mean by noisy data. If there's something that's adding more variation than in one group than another, or it's adding variation that's systematically different between those groups, then it might be impacting the outcome. And that's what they're talking about with noisy data. I'm going to move back to the PowerPoint here. Okay, so big differences, right, between those 3 groups, especially in the spread or the potential noise going on in the hybrid group compared to the other 2, which might have an alternative explanation that might explain differences in GPA in those groups. And that's what we mean by the researcher needing to control for the potential extraneous variables there. What are some alternative explanations for why you would see so much variation in the hybrid group compared to the other groups? It could be anything. It could be that you just have differences in the approach on that group. It goes back to standardizing the procedures, the random assignment. It goes back to those things of trying to control for extraneous variables. So another question that has come up in this class has been, how does the researcher deal with these different biases that might come up, like the bias from sample selection and the bias of expectancy effects? So back in chapter 4, we were introduced to demand effects, which is when the nature of the experiment itself might give participants a clue on the research question and thereby change the way they behave, like either because they're reacting to being observed or they feel like they know what the research question is and they're trying to help the researcher. So that would be things that could impact the ability of the experiment to determine what effects are truly due to the independent variable. And a couple other issues that might bias a study come from selection bias, like volunteer tendencies, or unintentional expectations of the researchers themselves. For example, in our what if, we're looking for differences in performance or in learning outcomes due to different types of class delivery, right? So if we ask students at the beginning of the term who would like to participate in the study, their choices on whether or not to participate in the study may change the outcome. And this would be volunteer bias. If we only use students who chose the class style because they already like that type of delivery and they participated, then the study would not generalize or be representative of all students. So how does a researcher deal with a volunteer bias? Well, there's limitations on what a researcher can do to encourage a diversity of volunteers. In the example of students participating only if the delivery style was their preference, the researcher maybe could provide extra credit or some kind of compensation for participation to encourage more students to participate. Also, another way the researcher could ask the students, the participants, to rank their delivery style. And that way you can actually account for it later. You can find out if preference for delivery style was a confounding variable if you actually measured it. You can't actually control for something that you didn't measure statistically. Another potential bias area is expectancy effects. For example, if the same instructor teaches all sections, if the researcher teaches all those sections of Intro to General Psych, right? They teach the face-to-face, the hybrid, and the online. He or she might convey their preference for hybrid learning without intending to do so. And that would kind of portray those expectancy effects, and that would impact, right? Maybe one way to do that, to account for that, would be to have different instructors for each section, right? But as we said, having different instructors adds a different type of unintended variation, that the instructors themselves might have different styles, right? And maybe that's what's impacting the outcome. Another potential confounding variable, right? So how does a researcher deal with expectancy effects? Again, this can happen when the researcher's knowledge of the study leaks into the way they are conducting the study. So a couple of ways to address this is by using standardized procedures so that each class is run the same, like it's got the same content. Maybe it has an instructor that's not the researcher, and you want that instructor, who's not the researcher, to not know about the research question. That's what they call a double blind, where the research assistants don't know what the research question is about. They're just running the protocol, running the study, and then not having any other involvement with the study, before that. So a couple of different ways that researchers deal with these two types of biases. So that kind of concludes what we have here. What you want to remember, experimental research evaluates a causal relationship. It's the only one that can, but it does have strict conditions. It's got the condition that the researcher has to manipulate the independent variable. There's some variables that we cannot manipulate. We can't manipulate someone's gender or belief system or ethnicity or different other values or preferences. We can't manipulate that. But there are different conditions that we can manipulate as researchers, and then that's something that can be used in experimental research. The other they have to control for extraneous variables. Whatever potential alternative explanations, they have to control for. And that can look different ways, right? We saw that in between subjects experiments, we want to look at random assignment to even out those potential individual differences. But if it's a within subjects design, we have to do counterbalancing to address potential order effects. So controlling for extraneous variables sounds like, oh, just do that. But it can get rather complicated once you consider all of the potential different explanations for changes in the outcome. One last thing I wanted you to see was some areas in Canvas that I've created for you. So we have in the modules and down to Module 2, page number 5 for Chapter 5. So in here, we have our regular overview, resources, and deliverables. In resources, you'll have your link to this video, the link to the PowerPoint, and if you want to play with the data set that we looked at, you can. I know at this point you probably have not done your JASP orientation yet, but it's there in case you want to play with it. And then I have a couple of videos here, one regarding random assignment that's good to watch, and one that goes into more details on experimental designs. And they're both about 5 minutes each. And then your deliverables tab, which has just watching the lecture and assignment videos, reviewing the resources, posting your questions to the discussion board, your quiz, and it's time to start working on your Article 2 summary. All right, that's it for today, and looking forward to seeing you in the next video or on the discussion boards.